When Clark Lee took over for Vanderbilt, I think there were a lot of people that had optimism, but it was almost a cautious optimism. You didn't really know what you were going to get with a new head coach for the Commodores, but he obviously did a really good job of building this program. And last year was surprising, but not to the people that are in that building. They're looking to replicate that success or even build upon it in 2025. We take a deep dive into the Vanderbilt Commodores and look at what we should expect for this season. Before we do that though, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video. It goes a long way in helping the channel grow. And today we are taking a deep dive into those Vanderbilt Commodores. We'll look back at 2024, and honestly, there were a lot of people that were shocked by how this team competed. Again, nobody inside that building, but outside of that building, there was definitely skepticism about if this team could be competitive. The Alabama win essentially erased any doubts about this team and Clark Lee's ability to make them a winner. And now you're looking to replicate that success. And we haven't seen that for quite some time. And that'll be a different challenge. You don't have the element of surprise this year. That's probably the one thing, if you're a fan of Vanderbilt, that you're not going to have as much. You might surprise some people because there's probably plenty of people that still doubt how successful you can be, but there are definitely people that know that you're the real deal, that you are capable of pulling off an upset like in Alabama. So it's going to be interesting to see how do they handle that new challenge. How do you handle the new level of competition that you will face, because teams do take you a little more seriously. In the past, Vanderbilt's been that team that everybody just kind of circles as a win, and that's no longer the case. So that's a new challenge, and I know Clark Lee and his staff are excited to meet that challenge head on. And like I said, this has been a really fun group to watch, and it'll be interesting to see how they step up in 2025. When you look at the roster changes, this is a group that honestly, overall, I would say does not lose a ton of top end talent, which bodes well for a team that is, again, looking to take on a challenge that is much more difficult than it was last year. So you feel pretty good about the roster changes. You feel pretty good about who you bring in, who departs. Losing certain players like Quincy Skinner probably it isn't great, but I don't think you're hurting too bad at that position. DeRicky Wright is going to be a big loss for them for sure, but that secondary is going to be really interesting for different reasons in 2025. You have other players that you potentially lose that are more depth pieces really than anything. So I think that they feel that they're in a good spot heading into this year. Then when you look at the talent they brought in, again, you lose talent that you don't necessarily feel is going to put a huge damper on any of those positions outside of a couple people. The defense probably takes more of a hit than the offense, but you did a good job of replacing some of that talent, bringing someone like Jordan White and Sterling Porcher on the offensive line, throwing Bryce Henderson as well, and Isaiah Glass. I think that you did a good job of addressing your needs in the transfer portal. Now, you could say the offensive line is going to be a question, and when you bring in that many transfers, yes, probably, but I like the talent level that they bring in. I think that's a good amount of starting experience that you bring into your offensive line. And yeah, you're going to have to find time to let them gel with each other, but you're feeling like you're in a pretty good position. You also bring in some guys with potential in Keanu Coate, Trey Richardson, Jordan Matthews, Trent Hudson. You bring in guys that some of them maybe less proven or not proven at this level, and giving them a chance to play on a team that embraces that underdog role. I think they did a good job of bringing in guys that fit that description. So you feel like you got the right guys to enter this culture. You know, that's a big part of what makes Vanderbilt so successful is guys buying into the culture, buying into what Clark Lee and this coaching staff, this program is saying. If you do not get that buy-in, you probably don't have the success that you did last year, and Clark Lee's probably on his way out the door. But because you have that buy-in, you've recruited the right guys, you feel like you're in a really good spot to make noise once again. We'll start with the offense when we dive into this team. And everybody's favorite quarterback, Diego Pavia, is back. You know, we had an interesting offseason for Pavia in the JUCO ruling that allowed him to come back and return for what could be a really fun season after his first year as a starter with the Commodores. And I think there were some people, I mean, including myself, honestly, when Diego Pavia came to Vanderbilt, I thought that there were only a handful of Power Four schools that he could transfer to and be extremely successful. I don't know if I necessarily saw this coming, but I thought that he had the tools to be a really fun player at the right school. It turns out that that school is Vanderbilt, and we saw exactly the fun that he provides on Saturdays. Over 2,200 yards, nearly 2,300 yards passing, 20 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. I think that was the biggest reason for their success, was his ability to be efficient with the football through the air. Maybe not the best completion percentage, but he took care of the football, plain and simple. He also rushed for another 800 yards and 8 more scores. So this is a guy who nearly had 30 touchdowns and over 3,000 yards. So that's huge for a team that, again, quarterback at times has not been great for them. So that was a big reason why they thrived. And they're hoping that that's going to be the same in 2025. And again, this offense, when you look at the numbers, there weren't a ton of things that they looked overly elite at. And there weren't a lot of things that I think there's some things that they did not look good at either. But one thing they did is they won the turnover battle time and time again. They made big plays when they needed to, and they limited mistakes in big moments. And that's going to be a recipe they probably have to follow once again. Though I will say some of the continuity that they bring back will help a ton. The fact that some of these guys are more familiar with each other, they understand where this certain player is going to be, that works for Diego Pavia and this offense. And Pavia, again, is one of the, I think, most well-liked quarterbacks in college football. I think a lot of people like his story of where he came from, and now he's on a Vanderbilt team that was kind of the floor mat of the SEC. The rushing attack will be interesting with Pavia because you return Cedric Alexander. You also get AJ Newberry stepping up into a bigger role. How does that play out for them this year? I think Cedric Alexander is a proven commodity, almost had 600 yards last year, 6 touchdowns. You might want to see him take a step forward, but we'll see what happens with the depth behind him. AJ Newberry is a guy that they really like, even though he had a ton of production from last year, 185 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I think that if this is going to be a successful offense, this rushing attack has to get better. You finished 86 last year. You'd like to see maybe some more explosive plays if you can. But again, when you're playing the SEC, sometimes you got to take what you can get. And when you're running on those razor thin margins, you don't necessarily have as much room for error. So you have to win those turnover battles. The depth behind both running back and quarterback is probably where you have the most concerns on this team. If Diego Pavia goes down, you might have to go to Drew Dickey, who's played 1 game in his career. Maybe Blaze Berlowich is the answer, the junior who has more experience. They're going to be battling for QB2, so you're hoping that Pavia stays healthy. The rushing attack, the running back position, kind of the same thing. You have guys who have some experience, but not a ton. So health is going to be a big concern there. But we saw them do it last year, so there's really not a reason why you're too worried about that. But again, when you're just looking at it from the surface level, that's one thing you could see as a potential problem. Or if things don't happen to go right, that's probably what happened. But if things do go right, Pavia plays well. I mean, we've seen what Pavia can do at his peak, and we've seen what he can do against Power 4 competition. Though those doubts are gone, it just comes down to health. And is the depth behind them better than we think? Or it could, because it's just unproven? Or is that unproven talent going to need some time to get acclimated to their new roles? And then part of that is going to be the passing attack. So if Diego Pavia takes a step as a passer, it'll be because some of the continuity he has coming back. But this staff also did a pretty good job of identifying needs in the wide receiver position and bringing in guys that could potentially help that. I think they're looking for someone who could take the top off of the defense when you lose the amount of talent that you lost. Something like Quincy Skinner is going to be a big name to lose. But bringing in Trent Hudson, they feel like he is the answer to that problem. They feel like he has the ability to stretch the field vertically, which helps guys like Junior Sherrill and Richie Hoskins thrive even more. Now, both of them are very capable of making plays on their own, but Trent Hudson was someone that they felt fit really well in their system into what they were looking to do through the passing attack. You also bring in Chance Fitzgerald from Virginia Tech. We mentioned Trey Richardson before. He averaged nearly 19 yards per catch at Washburn. So maybe he is also another answer for stretching the defense. But again, going from that level to the SEC is a huge jump. So there's going to be natural hesitation when you think he's going to take a step or potentially play a bigger role. Tristan Brown and Joseph McVay are guys to keep an eye on too. McVay only had one catch, but took it for 65 yards and a touchdown. So you don't really know exactly what you're going to get with him, but you have at least one play to look at and look through what is he capable of doing. Then you go to the tight end position, and Eli Stowers is going to be a name that most people know on Vanderbilt besides Diego Pavia, and he was a really fun player to watch for them as well. First team All SEC as a tight end, and going to be more of that pass catching tight end, which is exactly what they need him to do. 49 catches last year for 638 yards and 5 touchdowns. The depth behind him isn't as proven as some other positions, but I think that Cole Spence bringing back his 10 catches from last year is decent enough depth where you're not overly concerned about what happens if Stowers needs to get off the field or he gets hurt. Then you also have Cameron Johnson, who, again, less experience, but his one catch that he had did go for a touchdown. So the tight end position, not as much of a concern as some of these other positions, but I think that there is definitely a drop off if Stowers happens to go off the field. But again, this passing attack feels like it's pretty solidified. You have your quarterback coming back, you have your wide receivers, you address some needs at wide receiver, and you also have a decent group at tight end. So really, overall, you're not really worried about what this offense can do because the right positions have the right players coming back. And I think the staff did a really good job of bringing in players to fill some of those needs. And the offensive line is right up that alley as well. The offensive line is a group that will feature 4 new starters and 4 new faces to this program. The nice thing, though, is that they have plenty of competition. So the starters, we'll see what actually happens, but Isaiah Glass, Sterling Porcher, Jordan White, Chase Mitchell, and Bryce Henderson should be the guys that get going up front. Glass comes in from Oklahoma State, very experienced with 33 games and 23 starts, including 8 starts last year for the Cowboys. Sterling Porcher was a huge get for them. I think that he'll be one of those guys that we'll be talking about towards the end of the season. Another guy with a ton of experience, 37 games and 36 starts under his belt. Jordan White, that Liberty program took a ton of hits to the transfer portal. Jordan White is a very talented interior offensive lineman, can play center, can play guard. You can move him all over the offensive line, and he'll probably be pretty successful, knows how to handle things, but getting him at center is, I think, a very underrated addition that not a lot of people are talking about. Chase Mitchell is the lone returning starter on the offensive line for Vanderbilt. 13 starts last year for this team, 33 games overall in his career, 27 career starts. So he is someone who helps these guys get acclimated with culture, understanding where things are on campus, where things are in the training room, all that different stuff that maybe you don't think about in this transfer portal era because people are so focused on other things. Having a guy like Chase Mitchell back gives them the flexibility to focus on other things, the coaching staff to worry about other things, and he can get those guys up to speed with a new playbook and how they do things at Vanderbilt. And then Bryce Henderson is an interesting addition, comes in from South Dakota, and you're looking at how do you transition from the FCS level to the FBS level. There's a lot of people that aren't necessarily worried about him. I mean, he's 6'8", 320 pounds, so his size is definitely not a concern. It's just going to come down to, can you handle playing in the SEC? Playing it against NDSU is very difficult, but going against guys in the SEC that you'll face is a whole different level of competition that he has not experienced before. But it's an exciting opportunity. And when you look at some of the players they brought in, you don't have a ton of concerns about can they elevate their game to this level. And then you look at the depth. Now, the depth is very interesting for this team because you don't have a ton of starts, but you have a ton of experience. So when you look at Misael Sandoval, Charlie Clark, those guys both played 13 games last year, but didn't start any games. Then you look at the one guy that did start. Kevo Wesley is definitely going to push for time. I think that he'll definitely see the field plenty and maybe even start if inconsistent play arises. You bring in Gunnar Givens from the transfer portal, another guy that could push for starting time. And then you have a couple other guys in Cade McDonald, who will be behind Jordan White, and Gage Pitchford, who has 7 starts in his career. And again, another guy who played 12 games last year, didn't start, but has good experience. So you have plenty of guys that are capable. It's just a matter of what is the ceiling for this group and how do they gel together. Again, it has nothing to do with right now with who's around them at the skill positions. They have to work with each other and figure out how each other operates, how they're going to make this work with 4 guys learning a new playbook. And the potential is very exciting. I think that all of these guys they brought in fit this system really well. They fit this culture really well. And the guys around them have plenty of experience to help them get acclimated. And also those guys have the ability to step up if needed. So even though the offensive line has the most turnover, I think there aren't as many concerns as you might think. Then when you flip to the defense, honestly, this defense is one of the most underrated defenses in college football. And when you look at the numbers, it's kind of easy to see why. But again, this is a team that thrived in the turnover battle. When you're looking at turnover margin, this is a big reason why they were successful. And it's this defense that played a huge role in that. You obviously need to take care of the football, but you also need to create turnovers. And part of that starts up front, and they have a good mix of guys that are disruptive, guys that can plug up running lanes, can plug up any openings that might arise, and it starts on the edge. Corday Sindor is a guy who probably flew under the radar last year. When you look at his tackles, you think, oh, 14 tackles is not that many. But when you look at his disruptive numbers, 7 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, now he steps into a bigger role with some of the guys that depart. He is someone that could have even more production and could be even more disruptive. That's something that when you're looking at this team, how do they take that step, right? So we talked about before, how do you go from a team that surprised everybody to now everybody gives you the respect that you deserve and they're not giving you the element of surprise? Where do you find ways to make up some ground? He's one of those guys. Opposite of him on the edge, that defensive end linebacker position, Miles Capers is someone who is going to get a ton of attention. 46 tackles last year, 8 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. He is someone that can get around the edge and be extremely disruptive. Behind him, Nick Rinaldi is another guy who does the same thing. And Rinaldi will also play a little bit of linebacker as well, so they can move him around. And you also bring in, if that has to happen, again, this is where you get depth. So Rinaldi gives you depth at 2 positions. You bring in Keon Coet, who this staff is really high on, comes in from Alabama. They want him to contribute right away. So this position alone gives you depth just because of the talent you bring in as well as who you return. And Linus Dunk is another guy on the edge who could play a bigger role. Didn't have a ton of production last year. But again, you're looking at a group that has the right guys in place. Then you look at the interior. Now, the starters are set. And one of the areas that this staff felt they needed to address was the interior defensive line because of the lack of depth behind Glenn Seabrooks and Yilinan Uotera. You're looking at 2 guys that have huge frames. And Seabrooks comes in at 6'3", 340. So you have 6'3", 340 and 6'7", 311 pounds for Uotera. That's absolutely insane for even the SEC. Those are 2 big bodies that, again, when you look at the production, you have a combined 59 tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. So again, playing in the interior is a thankless job. You don't actually have the production of some of your exterior or on the edge teammates. So those are guys that really do a lot of that thankless work and get the job done on the interior so that others can thrive. And they have two starters that are coming back that will know exactly their role, what they need to do. And then from there, that's where you need to figure out who's going to be the next guys up, because this is a position where you're going to need to rotate guys in. The life of an SEC interior defensive lineman, or just any lineman in general, is brutal. You're playing against top tier talent week in and week out. You're getting tired. You don't see tackles play the whole game nowadays. So this is a position where this staff said, we need to figure something out. We need to bring in talent. So that's why you see Aaron Bryant comes in from Texas. They really like what he could do in this rotation. You bring in Mason Nelson from Western Michigan. You bring in Jalen Stone from Southeast Illinois. You bring in Joshua Singh from BYU. You brought in a ton of talent at the tackle position just to produce competition. You also bring back Zaylen Wood, who could be a contributor. So the top two guys, set. The other two guys, not so much. The depth really is where this is going to be a concern. So if you're looking for a place, once again, we talked about where can you make up that ground? Where can you get better? The interior defensive line is a place where they can step up and improve. And if they're able to find the depth they need and play the level they're capable, this is going to be a fun defense, because everything starts up front and everything is going to be better if your defensive line is having solid performances every single week. And that makes life easy for the guys behind you too. And the linebackers are a very talented group, but they have a much easier life if their defensive line is making life miserable for the guys in front of them. Now, Brian Longwell and Langston Patterson coming back gives them one of the better duos in the country, and probably a duo that a lot of people don't necessarily know by name. I think if you asked who those two were, you probably wouldn't get a ton of Vanderbilt responses. I don't think people really know who they are, but that's okay. And this is a group that has plenty of depth, so you don't have a ton of concerns about the linebacker position for Vanderbilt. Longwell comes back with 89 tackles and 8 tackles for loss. You also look at Patterson's production, and these are guys who are experienced and have plenty of games under their belts, and Patterson is one of them. He's been playing for a while. He has a ton of experience. He comes back after a year in which he had 78 tackles, 5 tackles for loss. But then you look behind them, Prince Colley and Bryce Cohen, who were both backups last year, both of them are back. And while they don't have the greatest production, it's because they didn't see the field, because Longwell and Patterson were playing so well. And that just means that you have great positional depth. And like we mentioned before, Nick Rinaldi is someone who can step in a pinch too. So you have good natural depth. You also have some young guys that could step up. So Austin Howard comes in, probably going to sit behind in redshirt because you have so much depth. You feel like you're in a pretty good spot with what you have at linebacker, that you don't necessarily need to push a guy like Howard to start, but he's definitely a name to keep an eye on. Someone who could potentially find himself on the field. I mean, you're going to see these freshmen put on the field eventually. It's just a matter of how many games do they need to play. And if you're Vanderbilt, you feel like you're in a good position because you don't have to thrust him into a starting role because of the guys you have coming back. Longwell and Patterson are big names to have returning for this defense, and getting everybody else into position, especially with some of the new guys up front and some of the new guys that are going to be behind them. These two guys have such a vital role for the success of this defense that having them back is more important than just the production that they bring. The leadership that they bring, the intangibles that they bring to this defense is something that Clark Lee is really going to enjoy this year. And we'll go to that secondary that does, like I said, they lost a couple of key pieces, but they do bring some interesting players. Now, nobody's going to replace DeRicky Wright. I don't think anybody's going to say that. You might have the same argument for CJ Taylor. You have guys that you're just not going to replace, and you might have lost two guys that fit that description, but this staff did a really good job of identifying talent to bring in and compete right away. So CJ Hurd is one of those guys that comes in from FAU and is going to fill one of those safety positions, not necessarily going to replace Ricky Wright 1-1, but gives them experience and excitement that can get your hopes up for this year. Dante Carter's a young guy who comes in after some experience in 2024 and is expecting to do some really exciting things in 2025. The cornerback position is interesting. Martel Height returns, solid corner for them last year. You also bring Jordan Matthews in from Tennessee. Not a ton of production last year, but a guy that they're very high on and expect big things. At the star position, which is that linebacker safety hybrid, Randon Fontenette comes in to, last year he came in from TCU and we weren't really sure where they were going to play him, whether it was at safety, maybe at linebacker, but they find a position for him where he thrives. 73 tackles, 8 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 8 passes defended, 1 interception. Did a little bit of everything for this defense, gives them that queen chess piece, if you will, where you can put him anywhere, move him anywhere on the field, and you feel like you have a weapon that not a lot of people have. Now, the depth behind him maybe is a concern, as you just have Jalen Ruth and a freshman listed currently on the roster as the star positional depth. So we'll see what happens there. His health is a vital part of this defense. The other transfer that you bring in the secondary, Marlon Jones comes in from Eastern Washington. Again, when we talk about FCS to FBS, do you have the talent? Do you have the tools? Which, if your staff is recruiting you to come via the transfer portal, they think you have the tools to make big plays. And he did that at Eastern Washington. They think that he can do some really exciting things. The corner depth, honestly, is overall pretty good. Jalen Lackey and Colby Taylor are guys that figure to be part of the rotation if someone can't step up. If Matthews isn't what they think he is, they have plenty of talent behind them. They have good depth. It's just a matter of who's going to be that starter. At safety, Jalen Gilbert and Marlon Sewell are going to be those guys as well. So you have plenty of options, right? So if you're Clark Lee in this defense, you've done, and honestly, when you look at, besides defensive tackle or nose tackle, you have a lot of confidence in what Clark Lee is doing, simply because when you look at this team, you look at the lack of transfers. And not that they don't have any, but they don't have a ton of them that's dominating. And in this world where most people are taking a ton of transfers, this defense was built by Clark Lee. They've done a good job of identifying talent, and they've done a great job of preventing that talent from going to the transfer portal. Now, like I said before, though, this is the challenge. How do you find a way to surprise people again when they're not going to be naturally surprised by playing Vanderbilt? The over-under right now for them is set at 5.5. And that's enough to kind of put that surprise factor back into play. But when you face some of these teams, they know what happened last year. Some of these teams played you. They're very aware of what you're capable of doing. And this schedule is not going to do you a ton of favors. There's a lot of road games that are tough. You have to go to Virginia Tech, South Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Tennessee. That's not great. Those are going to be teams that, especially the SEC teams, those are teams that expect to be competing for a conference championship. So if you're Vanderbilt, you have to find a way to surprise those teams once again, because Alabama for sure is not going to forget last year. You can bet that. Now you're going to start off 1-0. Virginia Tech is a team that needs to get their act together, but going to Lane Stadium in September, where they still have a ton of hope, they still have a ton of excitement, that place is going to be rocking. That's going to be a tough one. And then to turn around and go to South Carolina, that is not an ideal start to your season. That being said, if we talked about the areas where they can take a step, if those players take a step, you can look at a potential 3-0 start. The South Carolina game is going to be tough. A lot of people are high in South Carolina, but we also didn't expect Vanderbilt to upset Alabama either. So not saying that's going to happen, but that's a game that is really important. Still sitting at 2-1 feels like a pretty good start. Then you're going to win the next 2 games. You're beating Georgia State and Utah State. Then there's that trip to Alabama. That's going to be really hard. Playing in Tuscaloosa instead of at home, that's really tough. and then you get a bye week halfway through the year. You go LSU and Missouri back to back, and then you go Texas Auburn right after that, at Texas as well. That's a tough 4-game stretch. Finishing the year with Kentucky and at Tennessee, it's easy to see why this team could potentially finish 5-7. But if you look at it with an optimistic view, 8-4 is probably the ceiling. And this is a group that won 7-6 last year. So 8-4 is an improvement. Going 7-5, 7-6 with a bowl game again is just as impressive as what you did last year. Because again, there's no surprise factor. There's no that element that people weren't anticipating. People know who you are. And now the new challenge, which Clark Lee and this staff are really excited about, is how do we stay here? How do we create staying power where we're a team that maybe not competing for a conference championship, but how do we stay in that middle tier closer to the top? How do we stay here? And part of that is building the roster, bringing in the right players to run your program, and identifying ways to keep them here. I think they've done a really good job of that. They've identified their needs and they've hammered the positions that they absolutely need. The offensive and defensive lines, unfortunately for them, are two of their biggest needs. So that's where the 5.5 probably comes in. Life in the trenches is not easy in the SEC. And if their guys figure it out and they brought in the right pieces, the 5.5 is almost going to look laughable. This is a really exciting team. Even without that surprise element, it's going to be fun to see what Vanderbilt can do to surprise us once again in 2025.